If you and your friends ever find yourselves running from a winged Nazgul in an open field with no cover, there's not much that can save you. But one thing that can is an extremely old man with a flashlight. I was at a local game store the other day that had a fresh restock of Middle-earth strategy battle game minis, a few of which I haven't seen in person for years. My hobby store stopped carrying them. But boy oh boy, am I a sucker for Lord of the Rings minis. Among the boxes on the shelves, I found 3 that would work perfectly for this diorama. The scene I'm depicting today is one that I've had in my mind for a long time, but I've been waiting to make. I have a lot of ideas like that. They're lying dormant, waiting for the right moment. And in this case, the trigger was seeing all 3 boxes together in one place. The Witch King was included as an option with the Fell Beast, but I'm going to be going with one of the other 9 for this diorama. As has been the case with all the Games Workshop minis that I've put together, these were a treat. Unfortunately, though, they are quite expensive. More expensive than I remembered. Also kind of sad that I'm not going to be adding them to armies. Then again, it's been years since I played the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game. So it wouldn't really make much sense to add them to an army now. Maybe someday I will pick up playing the game again. Just have too many hobbies and too little time. The Felbies went together with no other issues, and I moved over to Gandalf and Mr. Took. I assembled the horse-mounted Gandalf option that came in the box, and then after putting the mounted Hobbit in place, I was left with 2 leftover minis. You guys can think of a good way to use these. Please let me know in the comments. Now that I had Gandalf, Pippin, and Colfax, the last thing to assemble were the Gondorians fleeing the recently overrun city of Osgiliath. They all look a little too clean, in my opinion, given their situation, so a little customization was required. After removing most of the lances and replacing one with a sword, the minis were done, and it was time to move on to the next step. In case you don't remember, in the movie, Gandalf uses his staff like a bright spotlight to repel the fell beasts as they attack the retreating Gondorians. I thought about doing that with an LED filament, but that felt like it would look too much like a laser. Could have also painted the ultralight beam on a backdrop, but that didn't seem like it would be very convincing. So for now, I'll just put a bright light in his staff, and if I want to change that at some later date, I can do that pretty easily. I removed the top of Gandalf's staff, and for now I'll just be replacing it with a small metal pipe and a nano LED. I will sort out the ornate bit at the end of his staff later on. I wrapped the wires around his body in a way that would basically be invisible after he was painted. The wires extend from the LED all the way down through the base to the power source. And speaking of the base, I had 2 4x6-inch gesso boards that when combined gave me the aspect ratio that I was looking for. Once those had been glued together, I flipped them over and I glued them to a sheet of XPS foam, which I trimmed and glued together using some foam-safe superglue. The next step was to add some subtle variation to the ground's surface using a butane torch, which I kept pretty minimal because the Pelennor fields are pretty flat. Before moving on with the base, I masked Gandalf's light. I threw the rest of the minis on some painting handles, and I took them outside to prime. And we'll catch up with those in a minute. First, let's get some ground texture on the base, starting with a protective layer of Mod Podge. After a quick drizzle, I spread the glue around with my gloved hand, and I made sure to get the sides of the foam as well to protect them from the priming step, which will happen later. While the Mod Podge was still wet, I used it as a binder to hold on the seasoning, which in this case is sand and flocking, which I applied in a controlled, random manner. Next, I soaked everything with isopropyl alcohol, followed by a watered-down white glue mix. The isopropyl alcohol breaks the surface tension of the water and glue, allowing it to seep evenly into all of the terrain texture. The next step was to add some static grass, and I probably should have waited till the first round of wet stuff was a little drier, but I wanted to see how it would work. I'm also impatient, and it ended up working just fine. I shook off the excess static grass, and the last thing to do for now was to add some larger clumps of grass, and then it was ready to be set aside to dry. And in the meantime, let's paint some minis. And while I do that, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. While I did prime all of these with a matte black from a rattle can, I decided to use a white acrylic from the airbrush for the zenithal highlight. I've been doing that recently because I like the speed of the rattle can, but I like the finer application from the airbrush. After the highlight layer from the airbrush, I gave the minis their base coats using contrast paints. I painted those on using a combination of the airbrush and a brush. I didn't start on the highlights on any of the miniatures until all of them had their base coats. After the Nazgul and the Fellbeast, I moved on to the Knights of Minas Tirith. After that, I moved on to Gandalf, Shadowfax, and Pippin. After these three had some paint on them, it was time to add the top of Gandalf's staff again, which I did using hot glue. I put a big blob on the top there, and once that had cooled, I shaped it using some nippers. Now the light will appear a lot bigger, and his staff will also appear complete, even when the light is off. I painted the hot glue to make it look the part, and with all the base coats on, I could now break out the wet palette and refine the shapes and add all of the highlights. Last weekend, I went to Fan Expo in Denver. Gone the last few years, and among all the other things, it's always fun for me to see all the cool Lord of the Rings and Star Wars props and artwork that is on display or for sale, from which I draw a lot of inspiration for ways to use my new studio space when that finally gets off the ground. It's taken a lot longer than it's supposed to, and you will all hear about that story later on. But when it does get off the ground and I have my new studio space, I'm really looking forward to using it as a project in and of itself. I want to integrate props and displays and dioramas directly into the new studio in ways that I haven't been able to in my current space. After the Nazgul and his Fellbeast, the last of the minis to paint were the fleeing Osgiliathites. After that, I could return to the base, which was now dry, and paint that as well. I took that outside and primed it black, and I followed that up with coloration of the Pelennor fields applied from the airbrush. I gave everything a field drabby tan, and then built up the color a little bit more on the grassy areas on either corner. To get an organic looking dirt, I used a combination of a few different pigment powders which I combined and blended on the base, then activated with more isopropyl alcohol. After the pigment powders and isopropyl alcohol had dried, I finished the paint job on the base by highlighting individual blades of grass. With that done, it was time to install the Fellbeast. I drilled a hole for some additional support in the clear acrylic standoff that came with the Nazgul. I used a small wooden block and a pre-drilled hole, which I glued to the bottom side of the base to add a little bit of extra rigidity. The last thing we'd want is for this Fellbeast to be a fallen beast, which is, I guess, the same thing. With the winged Nazgul in place, I could now turn my attention to the horse riding free folk, starting with Gandalf. I drilled a small hole for the wires, which I pulled through, glued Gandalf in place, followed by the rest of the crew. With everyone in position, I could now move on to the finishing touches. I used a tea light candle to power Gandalf's staff, and the last thing to do was to paint the sides of the diorama with black 3.0. I ran out of 4.0. And after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time. And in case you were actually curious about what it would look like if a laser beam was being shot from Gandalf at the Fellbeast, there it is. Is it better? I don't know. Anyway, have a good week. I'll see you next time.